Well, first of all, thanks for having me down here. Don't mind the black eye. My wife actually slugged me when she was walking up the stairs the other day by accident. So I think it makes me look kind of mean, you know, with that little black eye rocking there. So any guy that puts up the nickname T-Rex on his first slide is either an a-hole or he's got a really good story to tell. So I'll tell you the really good story.
All right.
Because I like to save myself from the slings and arrows of the other. So I've got a 13-year-old daughter who's basically like 13 going on 21.
Oh, yes.
And yeah, you know that. She's got the Facebook. She's got the, you name it. And we had just sold the company to VMware in about 2007, and so I just started there. And one day she emails me, because every good father-daughter relationship's over email. You know, she doesn't actually talk to me. So she's like, "Hey, Dad, I need a cell phone." And I was like, "There's no way you're getting a cell phone. You know, I've seen Dateline to Catch a Predator. No way." She's like, "Oh, come on, Dad. All the cool kids have one. You're so stingy. You're like a T-Rex." And I was like, "Well, what the hell does that mean?" So I wrote back, "What the hell does that mean?" She's like, "Well, you're all mouth and your arms are too short to reach your wallet." And I was like, "Oh." So it was like literally my first week working for VMware, so I changed my auto signature to J. Tyler T-Rex Roar the First, and like emailed her back a couple times. But then I forgot to take the auto sig down, so it was about a month later, and someone's like, "So what's this T-Rex thing all about?" And I'm like, "Oh man, I'm sorry, it's my daughter, it's this joke we were doing." They're like, "Oh no, you got to keep that." So it's been about, I don't know, about 3 years. So far, so good. So that's where the T-Rex story came from. If it was self-given, I would definitely deserve a little bit of heckling.
That's funny.
So what we're all about, I'm a founder and CEO of this company called Liquidware Labs, but I'm probably not going to talk as much about what we do, and I'm going to kind of focus on what we're seeing out there in the market. And what I like to start with is kind of a line that I stole from Google, which I've yet to pay them any royalties on, which is, "It's our job in IT, perhaps, to try to create reliable computer systems out of intrinsically unreliable parts." Sounds like a pretty noble pursuit. And when I think about all the different unreliable parts that go into making a desktop computer system, I definitely add end users. You probably don't have them in your companies, but some companies have volatile and unpredictable and abusive end users. And so perhaps desktop virtualization or application virtualization, or maybe even this thing I hear about called the cloud, might be able to solve that. So this was kind of an old whiteboard that I came up with, I don't know, it was like 2007 or so, and I guess I'll go over here. I started thinking about all the different problems with desktops, whether they're desktops or laptops, or even in some cases terminal services and some of the thin computing we've done. And I know this is really small, but you know, we've got all these different users, and every user's got a different set of applications that they need and different profile appetites, right? That's a big challenge. And then, of course, I've got to marry each one of those images to a different physical piece of hardware, right? And hardware manufacturers are, whoa, that just blinked, that was crazy. It was me. Hardware manufacturers are really good at upgrading, hardware faster than we can keep our images up to speed. And then I add to that all the different change control and the fact that things do break. Hardware is only designed to last, 2, 3, 5 years at best, and then we go on that never-ending treadmill of the hardware refresh cycle. Well, when I looked at all the different, or we started thinking about all the different ways to take apart this computer system and maybe put it back in a more agile way, virtualization seems like a pretty interesting fix or fit. If we took away user data, right? If I got that off of hard drives and back into the data center, which is where it might very well belong, and I can back it up and I can replicate it and I can dedupe it and I can do all kinds of fun stuff if I get it off of that hard drive, and users can't lose it and drop it and need me to find it. And if I could get their profile off, like Josh and AppSense solution, I think that's a brilliant idea. If I didn't have that statically bound to a piece of hardware and I could deliver it in new and elegant ways, any device, any place, any time, that's a big win. And then there's some really cool technology, whether it's AppV or ThinApp or Thin Install Free. There's a ton of different solutions out there, ThinApp, that basically decouple the need to install an application and now just simply make it present. Either present by streaming or present as an object that would sit in a computer system. And what I'm really left with at the end of the day is x86 hardware, or x86 operating system and some hardware. And that's what virtualization does. We abstract that away, and we can set up all these neat virtual machines. So what we started thinking about was, well, that's a lot of moving parts. I mean, there's host implications there. There's network implications there. There's shared storage implications. There's remote display protocols. There's single sign-on. There's authentication. There's like all this different stuff that potentially would have to go into that stack. So what's important? We started thinking about, well, maybe it's visibility. If I was sitting there trying to throw darts at a dartboard to configure my environment to maybe take advantage of some or maybe all of those different moving parts, I would probably be fairly challenged. But if I think about what an individual user does on their system to their machine, but then I aggregate that across 100 or 1,500 or 10,000 users, little things don't seem that bad when they're confined to the four walls of this laptop. But when antivirus goes on simultaneously for a couple thousand users, really bad things happen. So the thought was, if we could look at that before, during, and after we start exploring these new technologies, well, that would be really, really interesting. And so I guess, in a way, we think that visibility before, during, and after is kind of key. I guess when I think about it, and this is really kind of what our software does, but you don't have to use ours. You could use other methods as well, which is kind of first and foremost, what do I actually have in my environment today? When I talk about what do I have, I mean, what's the configuration of each and every machine down to the last, bits and pieces? How big is the Windows page file? How many monitors? What resolution? What aspect ratios are those set up on? How large is my hard drive? What apps are present? What hotfix and patch levels do I have in all of my applications? Most folks would kind of get lost after, well, I think I've got a couple hundred desktops, and here's roughly the asset scale or asset life cycle of them. But then when I start thinking about, well, what is actually being consumed of those provisioned resources, that's where we really start losing visibility. So for example, how much CPU, how much memory, how much I/O to that local hard drive, how much network chatter is that user creating? Not just they themselves, but they along with 400 or 500 or 1,000 or 50,000 of their cohorts. So I start thinking about this, and I'm like, well, if I don't know what I have and I don't know what I'm consuming, it's really hard to figure out what I need, if anything. And so we said, okay, well, let's look at infrastructure, let's look at different systems, let's look at different configurations and users and applications, and provide some visibility to that. So when we think about, or when I think about VDI, there are some challenges that have been present for a long, long time. And we like to think that this process, just this logical process of saying, well, what do I have? What are my users using? I'll use that as the basis to determine what, if anything, I need to do. The first kind of bullet point that pops up typically is, well, am I selecting the right desktops in the first place? A lot of, I think, conventional wisdom was your call center was the perfect place to start, or task workers. I don't know. I'm probably a task worker, although I get really pissed if somebody was to call me a task worker. I'm not really sure what it means. But the theory is that instead of using a classification or my pay grade or what side of the building I sit on, maybe we should use the actual provisioning and consumption of resources to determine if I'm an ideal candidate or not. And I'll show you what I mean by that in a couple slides. And then let's say, for example, that I've now isolated 100 users, and these people are just absolutely perfect for desktop virtualization, for VDI. It's going to live in my data center. The software tells me so. Then I start thinking about, well, what's my design going to look like? What kind of host am I going to be on? Am I going to be on iSCSI or Fiber? Am I going to use RDP or ICA or VMware's new protocol PC over IP or NX, or just all the different remote display protocols that you could choose? There's a lot of different, I think, design variables that if you try to make them in a vacuum, they look really great on PowerPoint. They look really great when you lay them up there, but they typically don't have any applicability to the real world because, again, we haven't perhaps used the volatility to our advantage. We haven't used the influence of scale, what our users are all up to our advantage. And then and this is kind of selfish for the company that I'm a part of now, but if you can't measure it, it's really hard to manage it. So we're thinking about this from a holistic standpoint. Well, if I can monitor every different moving part of that stack, from the endpoint to the network to the actual virtual machine to the host it lives on to shared storage to any application servers to cloud-based services that are beamed in, well, if I can see when something does go bump in the night and a user calls up and says, well, my desktop's slow, it gives me a little bit, I guess, leg up on being able to very quickly pinpoint where that might be and, of course, hopefully remediate it. So that's one of the things we're thinking about. When I talk about VDI, I'm probably the most guilty of this. There's a lot of different technologies, like I think Josh was talking about before, that go into this. And we hear the term VDI an awful lot, and that could be VMware flavor, it can be Zen Desktop flavor, Microsoft, QuestV Workspace, Sun, Oracle, Symantec. Everyone's out there with some solution that's going to solve everything right down to world hunger. But the question is, well, which one's right for you? Is it who buys you the best lunch and learn, or is it based on what your users actually do in the course of a day? There's actually technology that can serve that purpose, and we think it's the latter. Desktop or WAN optimization, I hear that talked about as desktop virtualization from time to time. If I can speed up or cache client server traffic, and keep redundant bits from having to go over the LAN or the WAN, well, that's got to be VDI.